In today's episode, we're going to be talking about a creepy and weird dystopian novel, but it's actually creepy and weird for reasons that you probably wouldn't guess. Welcome back to another T-Rex talk. This is Isaac Botkin, and I am fascinated by dystopian novels. Science fiction in general usually depicts a future for people to aspire to or be inspired by. And oftentimes science fiction books have given people ideas that they later built out in real life. But then you have your dystopian novels, which are more like cautionary tales. And some of those are actually our most famous pieces of literature. Things like 1984 and Brave New World are not just some of the most popular dystopian novels. They're some of the most popular novels ever. So it's a pretty well-established genre at this point. But today I mostly want to talk about one book, and one book in particular. We'll cover the genre a little bit. In fact, this is a topic that I want to get into a little bit more in the future. And probably we should dig into some dystopian movies and different themes that we see in those over on the T-Rex Labs channel. But for now, I'm going to be talking about the book This Perfect Day by an author named Ira Levine. Now, I feel like I'm relatively familiar with dystopian novels, and I had never heard about this one. I want to thank my friend Ryan for putting me in touch with this book because it had never crossed my desk before. And the name of the author may not be familiar to you, but I guarantee you are familiar with some of his other work. He's the guy who wrote The Stepford Wives, Boys from Brazil, and Rosemary's Baby, just a lot of different books. And when he wasn't writing successful books, he was writing plays, some of which ran on Broadway for forever. And almost everything that this guy created got turned into a movie or a TV show in some way. So one of his first Broadway plays is called No Time for Sergeants, which not only ran on Broadway for a long time, starring Andy Griffith and Don Knotts, but it became a television show starring Andy Griffith and Don Knotts, and then it became a feature film starring Andy Griffith and Don Knotts, and basically launched those two guys' careers. And it probably also invented Gomer Pyle. So he's a very influential person in a whole lot of different ways. But of his many, many plays, 11 different plays, a lot of TV shows, 4 movies, of his 7 novels, they've been turned into about 10 movies and some TV shows. But This Perfect Day, which I want to be talking about today, no movie. And it's kind of strange. And you might be asking yourself, well, maybe that's because it's an early book and he hadn't really gotten famous yet. But no, let me go through the list of the novels. In 1953, he wrote A Kiss Before Dying, which is about a psychopathic serial killer. There are 2 movies of this book. 1967, Rosemary's Baby. There was a movie, pretty famous Roman Polanski movie. Such a big deal that the novel has maybe been forgotten a little bit, but the novel started a huge horror genre. It sold 4 million copies, and there's all kinds of people like Stephen King that probably owe a lot of their careers to the popularity of the novel. And it was right after that that he wrote This Perfect Day in 1970. And no movie. Now, 1972, he wrote The Stepford Wives. That's been turned into like 3 movies, a couple of different TV shows, and then there are sort of ripoffs. The ideas in Stepford Wife have been carried through a whole bunch of different science fiction properties and franchises. So, yeah, kind of a big deal. Then in 1976, he wrote The Boys from Brazil, which is a very interesting story about Nazis who clone literal Hitler. And then it's sort of a morality tale. Can you kill the clones of Hitler even though they're small boys that haven't done anything wrong yet? And that's a movie that was starring Gregory Peck, Laurence Olivier, James Mason. It got 3 Oscar nominations. Like, this is a serious movie in the eyes of a lot of people. At the time, they thought that Laurence Olivier was the greatest dramatic actor who had ever lived. Now, in hindsight, of course, we know that it was actually Don Knotts. But yeah, that was what people thought at the time. So this guy is box office gold. Actually, he's better than that. He is the goose that lays the box office gold eggs. He kind of took a little break for a while. In 1991, he wrote a novel called Sliver that became a movie with Sharon Stone. And then in 1997, he wrote a sequel to Rosemary's Baby that became a TV movie. I think it's a miniseries. So yeah, he has churned out a whole bunch of really interesting properties, some of which have become franchises, some of which have become genre tropes in their own right. And almost all of them have been really successful films. So it's extremely odd to me that this one book has no TV shows, no movies, and almost no discussion whatsoever. It has been swept, as 1984 might say, almost into a memory hole. In fact, it's been out of print for a lot of the last, when was it written, 1970? So yeah, it's a 50-year-old book, and a lot of the time it's been out of print, which is strange considering the book that he wrote right before that sold over 4 million copies. It's just weird in a lot of different ways. And maybe we will explain or maybe have some ideas why that might have happened as we get into what the story is about. And remember, his other books, he's kind of a horror-themed writer. He's got books about serial killers, Satanism, weird brainwashing, cloning of literal Hitler, video surveillance corrupting people. Like, it's not that he is afraid of scary ideas, and it's not that the filmmakers who adapted his works into movies were afraid of exploring some of these scary and creepy ideas. So, is This Perfect Day just too weird and creepy to be a movie? Let's get into the world. So the central figure in the world is a computer called Unicomp, and Unicomp controls everything about this dystopian future. All the people who live inside are controlled by Unicomp in a couple of different ways. Number one, as children, it controls their education and what it is that they are taught. It tells them what career they're going to be trained for, and it also tells them whether or not they're going to get married, or whether or not, if they are married, they're allowed to have children. It has pretty significant control. And then one of the ways that it gathers data about the individual subjects is through weekly, I would say, therapist visits. Sometimes 2 weeks, sometimes 3 weeks. It kind of depends on how the person is doing. What sort of discordant characteristics might be revealed by the other way that it gathers data, which is everywhere you go, your whereabouts are tracked, not using a wireless device like this, because remember, this thing was written in 1970, but with a electronic bracelet. And everywhere that you go inside of the world controlled by Unicomp, which it turns out to be a global one world government sort of situation, everywhere that you go, you are required to scan your electronic bracelet at these different scanner points. And not scanning your bracelet is, that is wrongthink. It's not wrongthink. Wrongthink is from 1984. But that is a significant crime, and it will be reported. One of your jobs as a citizen is to report people who don't scan their bracelets. And the way that people are managed, their whereabouts are tracked, and their curriculum is built for them by the computer, and then they're talking to these therapists all the time who examine them, and then they are given injections. Every time they talk to the therapist, they are given a prescription. That prescription is supposedly vitamins that take care of them, various medicines, but it also includes tranquilizers and some level of hormonal control so that people are just very, very even-keeled. The emotions inside of this society are extremely minimal, and there really isn't any aggression, and there's an incredibly small amount of free thinking. And interestingly, there's not a lot of propaganda. Propaganda is usually a very important part of dystopian society, movies and novels, and there is a television time that people are supposed to spend or allowed to spend every single day. It's weird if you don't show up for it. You get reported, you get your dosage changed if you aren't there for it, but there's not a lot of detail there. It was kind of interesting coming from a writer who has produced so many scripts that got turned into TV and movies. He doesn't really believe that the media is that important once the computer can control a person's chemical makeup, once there can be those tranquilizers and those psychotropic drugs and those other hormonal manipulations of the person. So the therapy and the psychotropic drugs make propaganda essentially unnecessary. There certainly aren't the same kinds of billboards and things that you see in other things. So that is the basis for the society. It's a classless society, it's a cashless society. The obscenities and profanities of today are just normal conversation, but there are forbidden words. Hate and fight are two forbidden words that you're not allowed to say. And the society is supposedly built upon particular philosophers. There's a little nursery rhyme that the children are taught that you read in the book. Christ, Marx, Wood, and Way led us to this perfect day. So there are elements of Marxist philosophy that you can see in the society. There aren't really any Christian elements, but then Wood and Way are two fictional philosophers that you find out a little bit more about later. I believe Way turns out to also be a geneticist as well. And so that's the world. That's the creepy, dystopian, uniform world that our characters are revealed to be in at the beginning of the book. And there's just a lot of very interesting things in there. One of them is that the drugs that are being injected into the subjects, that is a temporary stopgap measure while the computer sequences human genetics and creates perfect genetic specimens, people that have enough gene therapy, their DNA has been tweaked to the point where they no longer need the artificial drug stabilizers. But there has been a certain level of eugenic success already. People are one family, they say. Everybody is basically the same color and has basically the same characteristics. The book doesn't go into a huge amount of detail, but people are essentially kind of tan, and they have kind of Asian eyes, and they have dark hair, and they all pretty much match. And there's only 4 names that are allowed. So everybody is allowed, all boys are allowed to have one of 4 names. They can either be named after Marx, Christ, Wood, or Way. And then they have a number, of course, because you have to be able to specify people. So everybody has what is called in the book a number. But there's this incredible pursuit of uniformity. Even death is uniform. Everybody dies at age 62, and they're told that that is a completely natural occurrence for death to occur at 62, and there's nothing that can be done about that, except maybe the genetic research that is happening is going to improve longevity. And then there's some other things that are kind of interesting. Not only is everybody part of a single homogenized sort of race, and there's this emphasis on uniformity, and there's this idea that members of this society are interchangeable, even though they have been given different jobs by the computer. There are some other changes to people as well. Either it is revealed later that it's not a genetic change. It is still part of the hormonal drug replacement thing that's happening. Men do not have facial hair, and women do not have breasts. There are certain changes to society that have come about through these hormonal stabilizations as well as the drug ones. So this interchangeable, completely uniform society is kind of interesting. But occasionally there are glitches. Occasionally there are people who, for whatever reason, reject the treatments, or the treatments don't work, and they are referred to by the system as the incurables. And they're not bad guys. They're just sick. You're supposed to pity those people. The people who are constantly being medicated are the healthy ones. And the people whose bodies are having trouble with the medicine or trying to be a little more natural, those are the sick ones. So kind of interesting. Right off the bat, you will notice that there are just a few, perhaps, similarities to modern society. We are not controlling an entire planetary one-world government with a single computer, but we are giving more and more of our decisions to computers. And there isn't this necessarily the same focus on eugenics that there was maybe 100 years ago, but there is an awful lot of dependency on therapeutic, psychotropic drugs and dependence upon therapy. And there is this idea that sick people are the ones who are not taking a lot of medicine. The healthy ones are the ones that are constantly drugged up, constantly seeing therapists, constantly being monitored, constantly being tweaked and adjusted and affected. So, and this is an idea, even though there isn't a movie of this perfect day. Some of these ideas do filter out and appear in other books and movies. So Equilibrium is a good example of this. The main idea of Equilibrium, and also borrows really heavily from Fahrenheit 451, because there's a lot of destruction of any books or paintings that would allow people to feel or kind of get their emotions running or get them thinking about stuff that would spur on an emotional response. That stuff all has to be destroyed by Christian Bale and Sean Bean. But there's also a very important drug component to that society. In fact, the name of the drug in that movie was supposed to be Librium. And they shot part of the movie talking about it, and then they realized Librium is an actual emotional stabilizer drug that already exists. It's already been created by the pharmaceutical industry. And so for legal purposes, they had to change the name. They invented a fake drug called Prosium, which is named after Prozac and Valium. So yeah, it's pretty obvious what they're talking about. And that's kind of an interesting thing. Obviously, there's a drug component in Brave New World, which we'll talk about in a second. But this is an area that is kind of interesting. It's interesting that this is something that Ira Levine was writing about in 1970. And I know that at the time, there was an emphasis on therapy. There was a lot of interesting self-medicating experiments going on at the time. And there was an assumption that therapeutic drugs that stabilize people and tranquilizers and things like this were a benefit, particularly in New York, where Ira Levine lived and worked, and also kind of out in California, where the people who turned his books into movies lived and worked. So that is a little bit interesting thing about the 1970s. Today, that's all behind us. No, just kidding. Today, almost 20% of all TV ad spend is specifically for pharmaceutical drugs, and most of them are psychiatric drugs. 76 million Americans are prescribed and are taking psychiatric drugs at the moment, and 55 million of those Americans are undergoing some other kind of mental health treatment. That includes therapeutic visits and also chemical stabilizers. So yeah, it's kind of interesting. You don't necessarily need a giant centralized computer or a big brother type entity to bring about pretty large dependence on these psychotropic drugs. Now, I mentioned before the two really big names in dystopian fiction, the 1984 book by George Orwell and then Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. These are really kind of milestone events for the genre, and also probably for fiction in general, and then possibly also for reality. And in many ways, these books are opposites. There are books that are utopian futuristic novels. I'm going to talk about those in a second. And then there's the dystopian ones. And 1984 depicts a world in which the state is just stomping on a human face forever with its hobnailed boots. The control that you get in 1984 comes from pain and horror and fear. This is the way that the human beings are controlled by the faceless state. And then Brave New World kind of is the opposite. There is a control that comes from drugs, not just stabilizing drugs, but drugs that provide pleasure, drugs that provide euphoria, entertainment, and amusement. This is the way that the people are controlled in his book. And I think this is important because technically, they both work. That's how people work. They respond to the carrot. They respond to the stick. There are a lot of similarities in the way that the governments are laid out, but the elements of control are kind of different. And This Perfect Day leans more towards the Huxley vision. Not only are drugs a really important part of this, but also there really isn't a lot of fear that is being implemented by the state. But generally speaking, books are going to go into one of these two categories. There's either going to be terror and fear that is very overt, or there's going to be a lot of pleasure and distraction and amusement. It's going to be one of those two different things that is the opiate of the masses, or is the control that enables the giant top-down totalitarian state to do its thing. And that got me thinking, I want to figure out when some of these different ideas started, some of these tropes that appear in fiction. The 1984 and Brave New World are the big names, but what came before that? So I did a little bit of quick research, and the first example of this type of fiction that I have been able to find is kind of surprising. It was written by a guy named Jerome K. Jerome, who, if you've heard of him, you are aware that he is not a horror novelist. He is not a futurist or a dystopian kind of guy. He is a humorist. He is a humor columnist. He is a satirist. His book, Three Men in a Boat, to say nothing of the dog, launched his career as a successful writer, and it also kind of launched the careers of a whole bunch of British humorists that came later, including P.G. Wodehouse. If you know about P.G. Wodehouse, you like P.G. Wodehouse. If you don't know about P.G. Wodehouse, you will like P.G. Wodehouse. But I think that he really got a lot of his ideas and basically lived in a niche that Jerome K. Jerome began. But what I think is really fascinating is this one particular short story that Jerome K. Jerome wrote in the year 1891. And it has all the hallmarks of your horror dystopian society, things that appear in almost every novel afterwards. It has the gray, bland uniforms. It has the complete equality and androgyny and uniformity of haircuts and skin tones. And it has the numbers instead of names. And it has weird human breeding to sort of stabilize and make everything equal. And it makes sense when you realize that he is satirizing an idea that is emerging in the late 1800s, where democracy and this equality and this kind of complete and total unity and the destruction of all hierarchy, these are all being kicked around in the late 1800s by a bunch of different people, including Marx, who is kind of a character in the book that we're talking about. And what he is doing is he is pointing fun at the sheer nonsense that these ideas are if you take them to their end conclusion. So the story is just really short. It's like 4 pages. A guy has a dream where he is in the future and people have taken these ideas to their logical conclusions. Men and women must look the same, dress the same, act the same. They must have numbers instead of names. They are interchangeable. And the state is anti-family because anti-family introduces differences, and differences are the enemy of equality. Sports is anti-equality. This is a very sarcastic book from somebody who is a very funny writer. And these ideas at the time are so far-fetched that they are to be laughed at, not to be worried about. That's kind of an interesting thing. He asks the guy, the main character, asks the guy that he bumps into, "Do you worship a god here in this future?" And the man says, "Yes, we call him the majority. A majority," capital letters, "can do no wrong." So this is, I think, a really important formative book. Even though he didn't write it as a fully fledged world-building kind of thought experiment, he was poking fun at something that the people of 1891 would see as ludicrous and laughable. And it's just kind of interesting to me that those are the tropes. Those are the things that appear in basically all future dystopian novels. But there were others that were kind of interesting. Jack London wrote a book called The Iron Heel in 1908. And he does something kind of interesting because a lot of these books are very speculative. They don't name names. They don't actually pull scientific or philosophical or political theories from people. But Jack London does. He has the socialists fighting against the oligarchs, and the bad guys are actually the labor unions who kind of try to play both sides against the middle. And they are the ones trying to usher in the brotherhood of man, which is a total, all-powerful state. Another really important book is the book We by Zamyatin. It was written in 1924 in Russia, and it has a lot of these same things. It has people that are referred to only by numbers. There are glass buildings so that the surveillance of the state can be total. The uniformity, the androgyny, the marching in step, the equality, all that stuff is there. And then, Orwell writes 1984, which we've talked about. And Brave New World is coming out shortly after that. And Brave New World, a lot of people have written about it as if it is the counterpoint to 1984, but Huxley said he actually wrote it as an argument against H.G. Wells. H.G. Wells did not write dystopian fiction, or at least he didn't think that he did. He wrote utopian fiction about how great things were going to be in the future. And I'm not a huge fan of H.G. Wells as a political theorist. He writes interesting fiction, to be sure, but his ideas are wishy-washy. They're all over the place. And his utopic novels are scary if you think about them. So it's interesting to go over these. He also changes his mind a lot. The first one he wrote was in 1905, A Modern Utopia. And it describes this world state that controls property and controls marriage and makes everybody be a vegetarian. And it's supposed to be this wonderful, wonderful place. And there's a few people who hate the idea, and they live in these exile islands. I want to talk about exile islands because exile islands appear throughout this genre as well. And H.G. Wells uses them just as a contrast, a counterpoint. He has to show how terrible and ugly and mean and barbaric people are when they're not part of his amazing system that he has dreamed up. But 20 years later, in 1923, he had completely changed most of his ideas because his next utopian vision is a book called Men Like Gods. And there is no state. There's just universal anarchism. There is no state or money or religion or anything. People only believe in science, but they're also telepathic somehow. And it's strange. So sometimes the utopic books are just as dark as the dystopian ones. So let's go back to This Perfect Day, because This Perfect Day is a book that really wants to be a movie. I think. It's a book that has a nice 3-act structure. It's paced well. It feels like it would be a fantastic film, especially coming from a guy who has written so many books that get turned into movies and so many plays that are performed on stage and then turned into TV shows and movies. So let's talk about this story for a second. I've described the world and kind of the general sort of like thought that is out there in some of these dystopian novels. Here is what is going on in that book. It opens with a boy named Chip. Now, Chip is not his real name. Chip is a nickname. Remember, there's only 4 names for boys and 4 names for girls. His real name is Lee. He is named after Wei, one of the 4 fathers of this futuristic society. But his grandfather gives him this nickname, Chip, because he's a chip off the old block. And he has one eye that's a different color than the other. So there's some things about him that make him a little bit different than other people. He's not quite as interchangeable as members of the family are supposed to be. And this kind of causes him to think about things in a way that other people don't. And his grandfather is a little bit of a rebel, a little bit of a weirdo. He helped build Unicomp back in the day, and now he kind of wishes that he hadn't. He's not openly rebellious, but he tells Chip, this is the computer. He takes him through and shows him all the storage banks and stuff. And he says, this is the computer. Before the computer existed, people used to be able to pick what they wanted to do. You should think about that sometimes. What would you want to do if the computer weren't going to pick for you? And that thought, that germ of an idea, is enough to send Chip down this course where he is a little bit more of a free thinker. He is a little bit more not rebellious, but a little bit more inquisitive than is good for a member of this perfect society. And it causes him to notice stuff that other people don't. Like he has a classmate who draws too much because he loves drawing. And he's not given enough paper or pens because you're not supposed to love drawing. And so Chip gives him his papers and pens and gets caught aiding this aberrant behavior and gets his dosages adjusted so that he is stabilized. And in this part of the book, the first half or 2/3 of the book, the narrator is describing everything that Chip is thinking and everything that Chip is feeling so that there's a lot of sympathy for this character. We, the reader, we do appreciate free thinking natures. We do appreciate inquisitiveness and wanting to take at least some level of control over our own destiny. So the society feels pretty oppressive, even though the character Chip has no idea how oppressed he actually is. Well, as he gets older and he gets allotted a job, he's a geneticist. He's working on sequencing the genome, although when this book was written, I'm not sure that sequencing and genome were phrases that were used. They don't appear in the book. He's working on the DNA of the people so that they can be further purified, further stabilized, further made grand and glorious members of this global family and society. But he bumps into some nonconformists, some people who have figured out how to trick the system and lower the dose of the drugs that they're getting, and so that they have a little bit more free agency. They have a little bit more libido. They have a little bit more interest in other things. And unlike the Brave New World and Fahrenheit 451 and Equilibrium societies, the world that Unicomp has created in This Perfect Day has not destroyed all remnants of the past. There are curated fragments inside of museums so that the people can see how terrible and barbaric that pre-Unicomp world was. But nobody even really goes to these museums anymore. And so the nonconformists, after they've lowered their dosage to the point where they have a little bit more free agency, they hang out in the museum and they look at the old artifacts, and they even smoke tobacco. And that's one of the expressions of rebellion that they have. And they have a little bit more sexual activity, and they develop relationships with one another. But here's the very interesting thing. When Chip is exposed to this world, when his dosage is lowered, when his mind becomes clear, when he's hanging out in this museum and he's seeing all these artifacts, and he's seeing books, which are in a language that he can't read, and he's seeing cars and he's seeing paintings and things, he wants more freedom. He wants to learn the languages so that he can read the books. He wants to continue down this path. And one of the creepiest parts of the book is not the gigantic top-down totalitarian society, but the fact that these rebels do not want to pursue actual freedom. They like a little bit more freedom than is the norm, a little bit more activity here, a little bit more free thought there, a little bit more fun. They can make jokes and laugh at them, and they can smoke tobacco. That's as far as they want to go. And so his idea is that we're going to figure this out, and we're going to figure that out, and we're going to go to some of these exile islands and see if there's humans there who are incurables. They put the kibosh on that pretty quickly. And there's other various things that happen in the book. I don't know if I should give spoilers. I can't decide whether or not I'm recommending this book as something that should be read or something that should be studied and understood as a bizarre, weird, creepy sort of curiosity. I don't know. If you don't want spoilers, stop listening now and go and read the book and finish the episode later. Like I said, it's a book that wants to be a movie. It's short, it's 3 acts, it's paced with all the turns that you would expect in a movie, all the twists that you would expect in a movie, the dark night of the soul, everything that Sid Field wrote about in the 70s, Ira Levine was working on in his books and in his plays and his movie adaptation. So it's not a particularly long read. It feels very much like a movie script that is turned into a book. And so here's what happens. This is another thing that is kind of interesting, an interesting take and a little bit creepy. When he gets caught and he gets his dosage back up to normal, he immediately has tremendous worry and pity for the other nonconformists. So of course, he reveals their existence to the therapists, to the state. And those guys are immediately tracked down, those guys and girls. They're immediately redosed. And they are immediately grateful that they have been turned in so that they can be not sick any longer. But Chip still feels deep inside of himself a little bit of guilt. Some of it is guilt that he didn't report on them sooner. And some of it is guilt because he did take something away, and he still feels guilt for turning in the guy with the notebooks earlier, and he's still wrestling with these things. And as the book progresses, it's very fascinating. When he gets caught, he is surrounded by not a police force, not jackbooted thugs, not robots. He is surrounded by his fellow citizens who are like, oh no, our brother is sick. He needs help. And even though he's punching them in the face and trying to fight his way free, they just grab him and hug him and try to get him the treatment that he really needs. And as soon as he has the injection, he's like, oh, I feel so terrible that I punched you in the nose. And the other guy's like, no, I'm just so glad that you are finally treated, brother, and you're not sick anymore. This is the sort of false peace that secular statism wants to bring to the world. Fight and hate are the only 2 bad words that you can say, and somehow all aggression can be taken away if you just have strong enough drugs. So this is the world that exists. And at this point, something interesting kind of happens. The narrator starts to take a little bit of a back seat when it comes to the thoughts and feelings of Chip. He rebels again. Only this time he figures out how to stop his injections totally. He goes cold turkey, no drugs. He is now a completely free thinker, and he figures out how to escape from the country. And he makes it. Sure enough, he makes it to one of the exile islands. These exile islands that are kind of a staple of a lot of dystopian novels. And Ira Levine does something that's really interesting here and kind of subtle and cool. And that is, the Exile Islands don't exist just as a contrast. He is a pretty nuanced guy for all of his faults, for all of his problems. This is kind of an interesting take because there are some appealing benefits to this perfectly managed and controlled society. And the Exile Islands, they are not the worst possible place that you can imagine, but they are also not great. There is a level of freedom that is there. The people who are on these islands are free, but they also are pretty lawless. There are people there who are bitter that they're no longer part of the perfect society, but they can't bring themselves to go back. There are people who lie and steal and connive. There are people who take advantage of the gullible, naive people who grew up inside of the perfect society, and they're just not street smart. It's a very interesting take, and I think it's fairly realistic, too, if something like that were to happen, how things would kind of pan out. Ira Levine is an atheistic Jew living in New York writing plays. That is who he is as a person. But he has this very interesting idea, which is not super optimistic about human nature, and he has an awful lot of traditional values that are still a part of his own personal worldview in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. And so his take on how the Exile Islands work is sort of interesting. And then there's an additional twist. Chip wants to go back and destroy Unicomp, which is like, I'm on board. That sounds great. But it's hard for him to get other people on board. It's expensive. A number of people have gone to destroy Unicomp before, and it's never actually worked out. He has to get people. He doesn't know if he can trust them. That is kind of interesting. And at this point in the book, the narrator is now completely detached from his thoughts and his feelings. The narrator is only describing what he is doing and what he is saying. So we kind of don't know what's going on at this point. Anyhow, his strike team is assembled. They do make it back onto the mainland. They do make it to the computer. And this is where there's a bunch of interesting twists. Again, this is a movie. It's a novel, but he assumed this was going to be a movie. This is Act 3. This is time for plot twists. This is time for revelations. This is time for showdowns. And he gets into the control room of the computer and finds not the computer, but a gigantic party. The party is a recruiting party. Everybody is welcoming him and his strike team to join the elites that actually run the perfect society. Unicomp, the computer, is real. It does control stuff, but not autonomously. It manages all the data and all the people, but there are elites who actually control the computer, program the computer, and do a lot of this stuff. And what is happening is Li Wei, the long deceased, we assume, geneticist and philosopher who helped build this entire thing, is still alive, surgically extended 200-something years old. And he is the head programmer of the computer. And he says to our main character, Chip, join us. You are a free thinker. You are clever. You are a problem solver. You understand things. We need you to help program the computer and keep stuff running. He uses the Exile Islands as the recruiting pool for all of the programmers that run the system, because the people raised inside of the system, they just aren't going to have the ability to manage stuff. The elites have to come from outside. The elites have to be free from the kind of rules and restrictions that bind other regular people. And this is kind of neat because this is the first time that this level of elitism appears in the book. And Chip is angry. He does not want to join, but they convince him that it's the only thing that he can do until, spoiler alert, it is revealed that he's just been stubborn this whole time. And as soon as he gets his hands on some more bombs, he explodes the computer and wins. But it's not really clear what is going to happen. He steals a helicopter and flies back to the Exile Islands where his wife and child are, and it starts raining for the very first time in the entire book because, or at least in the daytime. Unicomp controls the weather, so there only rains at night, so nobody is inconvenienced. As he flies home in the daytime in the helicopter, it is raining. It is clear that the defeat of Unicomp is total, and there's going to be a new world that emerges from the ashes somehow. And that is the end of the book. It's a great setup for a sequel if this thing were going to be a movie. The whole thing just feels like it wants to be a movie. And the fact that it isn't a movie is super weird to me. I know I've said that several times now, but I just can't get over it. That this guy who has made so many incredibly successful movies, this thing just disappears into a black hole. And again, it's not the most important, it's not the most valuable, it's not the most groundbreaking of all of the dystopian novels, but there's a bunch of interesting pieces in there. It's well written. And again, this is a guy who has an amazing box office track record. I'm shocked that nobody made a movie when the book first came out. I'm shocked that a few years later, when Logan's Run came out and made a bunch of money, that nobody said, hey, does the Stepford Wives guy have any Logan's Run type movies that we could make? Because the answer is yes. So here's what I think happened. There's basically three explanations here. The conspiratorial one goes like this. The New World Order that is depicted in the book is the actual plan of WEF and the UN and various other one world government types. And so they called their operatives in Hollywood and said, don't make this movie. It reveals our secret plans. Then there's the slightly more cynical explanation, which is the people in Hollywood, when they read the book about this dystopian future where everybody is drugged to the gills, dependent on chemicals. Casual sex is more casual and happens with younger and more androgynous peoples. They looked at that and they said, this thing is not scary. This thing is not creepy. We would prefer to live in that world than to make movies that describe that world as needing to be destroyed. I think that's probably kind of the more accurate one. If you think even about Ira Levine's colleagues like Woody Allen at the time, would Woody Allen prefer to live in the world of the book or to make movies destroying that world? I'm not going to say exactly. And then the third one is just maybe there was something complicated where somebody sued him for plagiarism, or the movie got optioned by somebody who just hung on to the option forever and ever and ever. That's the sort of thing that's also incredibly possible. But I've been Googling, I've been searching, I haven't found anything. So there still is no clear answer as to what happened with this book. And the fact that this guy wrote a book like this and it didn't get turned into a movie kind of cooks my noodle. It could be a whole bunch of different things. So hopefully that is something that is interesting to you. Even if you're not going to read the book, just kind of to think about the different ways that dystopic visions change the way that people think about the world that they are living in, or that they want to try to build or want to try to avoid. There's another thing that happens, which is when societies get really totalitarian, they get closer to that unified one world government thing, I have a feeling that their preferred dystopic visions will change. Instead of one world government movies, you're going to see like total societal collapse movies. You're going to see zombie movies. You're going to see Mad Max type movies. Instead of the cautionary tale being an all too powerful controlling totalitarian state, the cautionary tales will be about the collapse, the chaos. Order will be preferable to chaos in that particular time. And maybe that's what we're seeing in today's movies too. I'll leave that up to you to think about and figure out. This movie, or rather this book, did, I believe, inspire a lot of filmmakers, even though they didn't copy it. THX 1138 is a film that George Lucas made before Star Wars, and there's a bunch of elements from this book inside of that movie. Robert Duvall plays the main character in that film, but it has a lot of the same thing. There's no reproduction. Everybody is stabilized with drugs. Everybody has numbers, etc. Gattaca is a movie where the future world is controlled purely through genetic information. Your potential as a person is determined by your genome. There's elements of this story in that. And then I already mentioned Equilibrium. But I want to finish out this episode. I want to give the last words of this episode to the guy who kind of started this all going, Jerome K. Jerome. This is how he finishes his short story. It is a man who falls asleep and has this dream of this weird future. And then at the very end, he wakes up and he finds out that it's 1885 back on the McFly farm. No, just kidding. He wakes up and sticks his head out the window like Ebenezer Scrooge and is relieved to find that he is back home in 1819. And he says, through the open window, I hear the rush and roar of old life's battle. Men are fighting, striving, carving out each man his own life with the sword of strength and will. Men are laughing, grieving, loving, doing wrong deeds, doing great deeds, falling, struggling, helping one another, living. This is a fantastic description of life. Men and women who are made in the image of God, and yet they are still cursed with sin and with death. That struggle, that glorious messiness. And all of humanity's history has been trying to combine those two things as best as possible. And the utopian novels and the dystopian novels describe people's attempts to remove only the pain and the difficulty and the messiness and leave everything that is good behind. And so H.G. Wells tries very, very hard to do that on his own terms, on his own strength. And even Ira Levine admits that that is something that man cannot do on his own, even with the help of powerful computers.